Today I'm going to talk about my favorite albums from the 1970s. A decade that was full of fantastic rock music that evolved a ton as the 70s went on. The decade also had some top tier soul, jazz, and even electronic music. Many people think that the 70s was all rock music, but it really wasn't, and there's some really good efforts from other genres in here that I will talk about. At number 8, I have What's Going On by Marvin Gaye. This is one of the finest soul albums of all time, and it came after Marvin Gaye had been active for a decade as a Motown singer. In the early 70s, Marvin Gaye was going through a tough personal time that included problems with his label, tax issues, and he was also mourning the death of his musical partner, Tammy Terrell. In early 1971, he was preparing his next album, and he settled on the decision to make a concept album about a soldier returning from Vietnam to a completely different society than when he had left. The soldier tells a first-hand tale of racial, social violence, poverty, and drug use, all of which had become a major part of American society between the late 60s and early 70s. What's Going On was released in 1971, and it is a conscious soul masterpiece that Marvin Gaye actually produced and wrote on his own, which was not something he did that much of on his earlier work. For this particular album, he was backed by the collective band the Funk Brothers. On this album, soundscapes are smooth, they're lush, they're passionate, and they have a melancholy vibe in spots given the subject matter. The lyrics on this album are very poetic, spiritual, and religious. The opener and the title track is one of the most well-known and most iconic soul songs in existence and introduces the album's concept. The next track, What's Happening, Brother, talks about the cultural shock that the returning soldier faces as they come back from Vietnam. Flying High in the Friendly Sky talks about the drug culture and how that had emerged in the years between the late 60s and early 70s, before Marvin Gaye decides to get a little spiritual on Save the Children and God is Love. One of my favorites on this album is Mercy Mercy Me, which features some beautiful melancholy grooves as Marvin Gaye croons about some of the societal and even ecological issues that had arisen in the recent years before this album. The track Holy Holy doubles down on the religious theme, and the album's closer, Inner City Blues, touches on how inner cities were beginning to decay more and more at the time. Marvin Gaye made some very scathing and observant commentary on the way that society was trending. From a musical standpoint, this entire album is dictated in that beautifully, smoothly sung signature manner by Marvin Gaye himself, who again took more of an initiative in producing the album and choosing the musical direction. The album as a whole, it's beautiful in its music, but it's bitter and dejecting in its lyrics, bringing a noticeable and tragic duality that actually made this album as fantastic as it is. And while he had had some success with previous records, this was his most successful record to date, and he would enjoy musical prosperity from the release of this album all the way until his death in 1984. Number 7 on my list is The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars by David Bowie. We all know the greatness of David Bowie, and this is one of the earlier examples of his musical prowess. He broke out in the early 70s with albums such as The Man Who Sold the World and Hunky Dory, both of which exhibited an early glam rock style mixed with some very early punk influences. But his first true smash was this record, released in 1972. Musically, it was written by Bowie, but it was backed by his band, the Spiders from Mars, hence the title. And this is another concept album. This time it follows the tale of the extraterrestrial rock star Ziggy Stardust, who arrives on Earth and is loved by the people, but all of that love that he receives leads to ego issues and subsequently the character's downfall. And while it's not even 40 minutes long, this is a rock opera, which was a trend at the time. The album's entire A-side is upbeat and energetic, with 5 years setting the stage in a bit more of a calm, majestic manner than the rest of the record. Moon Age Daydream and Starman introduce the androgynous Ziggy Stardust to the audience. Starman is an upbeat, winding, anthemic glam rock track that shows Ziggy Stardust achieving that stardom and making it onto the radio, where he gives a message of hope to society. As the album moves on, the song Star, which is done in an energetic proto-punk style, shows Ziggy reflecting on himself as an ascending rock star, and it starts to hint to the listeners that Ziggy Stardust's ego is growing. The title track is a quintessential glam rock anthem that essentially wraps the plot of the album into one single song before the fast and almost heavy Suffragette City comes in with some more proto-punk and addresses Ziggy Stardust's sexuality, which is called into question throughout the album. The album's closer shows Bowie self-destructing on stage in front of all his adoring fans, which completes the downward spiral of Ziggy Stardust. So as you can tell, this is a very active concept album, and for me, it's my favorite David Bowie album, though there are a few others that are all very, very good. Musically, I do think this is the most infectious album by Bowie, and it has the most creative storyline of all of his albums, in my opinion. It was also an important album for the development of punk as well as glam rock, but the musical execution on here is nearly perfect regardless of genre. That late album 1-2 punch of Ziggy Stardust and Suffragette City are one of my favorite 2-track runs out of any album from the 70s. While it sounds pleasant and interesting at times, it manages to make a dystopian commentary on society, from political and social issues to self-image issues and drug use. It was one of the first records to address homosexuality and sexual preference. It's probably Bowie's most groundbreaking groundbreaking record, and it's one that really exploded him into stardom, which led to a very successful rest of the decade and a fantastic, amazing career. Next on my list at number 6 is The Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd. Some of you might not think this is high enough, some may think that it's too high. It seems like some people think this is the best record of all time, while others think it's highly overrated. I think it's a great record, it's somewhere in between, but I do think it's Pink Floyd's best. So after 6 albums and 2 film soundtracks, Pink Floyd had accomplished a lot by the year 1973. They were pretty well known for their first 2 albums with former band member Syd Barrett, who was actually kicked out of the band in 1968 due to drug problems. The band took a little while to reinvent their sound after Barrett's departure and ended up ramping quality on 1970's Atom Heart Mother and 1971's Metal. The Dark Side of the Moon took almost a year to record and saw Pink Floyd experimenting with some shorter songs instead of the long instrumentals which frequently showed up on some of their earlier work. The lineup consisted of David Gilmour on guitar and vocals, Roger Waters on bass and vocals, Richard Wright on keyboards, and Nick Mason on drums. It's the first time that the band had experimented with new recording technology which included multi-track recording and tape loops. Musically, the record is a stunning progressive art rock record and had elements of space rock, which was kind of an emerging subgenre at the time. The record opens with the atmospheric Speak to Me, which leads right into the stunning Breathe. The album's first full track, Breathe sets the stage with a calm, spacey atmosphere, with David Gilmour contributing spacey sounds using a steel guitar. On the Run is an entirely instrumental piece and sees the band pushing boundaries with the use of a synthesizer and backwards guitar parts. The track is a chaotic, uneasy piece that leads into Time, which actually starts with a loud chorus of clock bells and alarms before easing off into a much calmer musical soundscape. The Great Gig in the Sky, one of my favorites on this record, is dramatic, winding, sad, and it's a majestic piece with vocals from English singer Claire Torrey. It's one of the most emotional and heartfelt pieces on the album that's driven really by Richard Wright's piano. The B-side starts off with the album's 2 lead singles, Money and Us and Them. Money was the biggest hit off of the album and features a rather ominous minor chord progression over an irregular time signature. Pink Floyd's snarky, sarcastic lyrical content makes an appearance here, and it's something that would become very characteristic of their later work. The second single, Us and Them, is very atmospheric, spacey, and peaceful, but the lyrics deal with war, racism, and other societal issues. This showed an interesting duality, which was another signature trait of the band. Any Color You Like is an instrumental break that segues into Brain Damage, which was a nod to former bandmate Syd Barrett, though it featured abstract philosophical lyrics that were pretty much open to interpretation. The album ends with Eclipse, which is a musical buildup that leads into a cerebral outro to the record. The legacy of this album is pretty much unmatched. At the time of filming, Dark Side of the Moon is the 4th best-selling album of all time with nearly 50 million copies sold. Like Ziggy Stardust for David Bowie, it was the album that really broke the band out as an international success and changed their careers permanently. Number 5, After the Gold Rush by Neil Young. Neil Young is yet another artist that had an incredible run in the 70s and got his career started in the late 60s with some very solid work as well. In 1969, he released his maiden effort with his band Crazy Horse, entitled Everybody Knows This Is Nowhere. In the years prior to this, he was a member of 2 other bands, Buffalo Springfield and Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. For this next album, Young recruited members of Crazy Horse as well as Stephen Stills for musical contributions. After the Gold Rush was released in September of 1970 after nearly a year of recording, and due to the dissolution of his marriage at the time, the album would perhaps end up a bit darker and more sad than it otherwise would have, as there are references to lost love throughout this thing. Tell Me Why is a beautiful opener with some serene, pastoral folk rock passages, though Neil Young later said in interviews that he's not a huge fan of this song due to what he considers to be nonsensical lyrics. Lyrics aside, this is one of the more powerful musical starts to any of the albums on this list. Next up is the title track, where Neil Young flaunts his storytelling skills as he pens a tale that spans centuries. He tells 3 different stories over 3 verses, one of a medieval time, one of the present day, and one of the end of humanity on Earth. Coming back to reality, Only Love Can Break Your Heart is the first truly sentimental tale of lost love, and Neil Young does this in a lush, calm, and reflective manner. The album's centerpiece is probably the song Southern Man. This song is a commentary on the hypocrisy of the highly religious white population of the South, many of who preach the love and peace of Christianity while turning around and treating their African American neighbors like second-class citizens. One of the most politically and socially jarring songs of the time, Southern Man made some painfully accurate observations, and it did receive backlash. Lynyrd Skynyrd actually directly addressed Neil Young in their song Sweet Home Alabama. The album's second half begins with a cover of country singer Don Gibson's Oh Lonesome Me, before moving into one of the album's most celebrated songs. Don't Let It Bring You Down was actually written in response to a previous breakup during the Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young days. As the album winds down, we get the beautiful Birds, which deals with his feelings and emotions he had from another previous breakup. I Believe in You continues this theme further and has been widely covered by many artists in the years since its release. It features Neil Young playing piano and vibraphone and brings the album to a sentimental close, though not before the seemingly random random, jovial, and downright fun Cripple Creek Ferry. Neil Young continued to solidify his legacy early in his career with this record, and it's one that really set him aside as one of the most talented singer-songwriters of all time, during a time where singer-songwriters were a dime a dozen. He successfully mixed the folk rock of that area with country music influences and created kind of a niche sound of his own, which is a sound that he would build on as his career went on. He went on to have a legendary decade and a legendary career, and a lot of his success started with this record. Number 4 on my list, Bitches Brew by Miles Davis. Miles Davis was one of the pioneers in the mass emergence of jazz in the 50s and in the 60s. So by the end of the 60s, Davis was about as much of a household name as you could get for a jazz artist. At the same time, styles were rapidly changing within jazz, as the hard bop and post bop styles were quickly evolving. It was during the same time that rock music was really emerging and becoming popular that jazz began to fuse with rock music. The genre of jazz fusion became a very important part of music as the 70s began. The jazz fusion style was first really utilized by Miles Davis on his 2 albums released in 1969, but this was especially prominent on his smash hit album In a Silent Way. In August 1969, Davis and his band gathered in a New York recording studio, and at the time his band included major players in jazz like Wayne Shorter and Chick Corea. And it was these recording sessions in August of 69 that would become Bitches Brew. About 6 months later, in March 1970, the 94-minute double album was released. And while it was not originally well received from a critical standpoint, in the year or two following its release, it became very, very successful. The album's A and B sides featured the song Pharaoh's Dance and its title track, and alone those 2 songs are 47 minutes of music. Like many musicians around this time were doing, Miles Davis and producer Teo Macero utilized tape looping and inserted some effects into songs like Pharaoh's Dance, which help it set the stage for the rest of the record. Pharaoh's Dance and the title track are psychedelic, crammed full of effects, and wind up and down for more than 20 minutes per track. The entire rest of the album flows together as one relatively fluid piece that does tend to run together a little bit, but there are passages in every track that very much stand out and make this such an ambitious, unique jazz fusion record. And while there are many examples of Miles Davis' greatness throughout his career, and many of them transcend different eras of jazz, it's hard to believe that any of these albums are more ambitious, well-crafted, and mood-inducing than Bitches Brew. Right on down to the album's excellent, trippy cover art, this is an unbelievable piece of music that needs to be appreciated. This album will blow your mind, and if it doesn't, well, I don't know what to tell you. Number 3 on my list, Led Zeppelin 4. Led Zeppelin burst onto the scene in the late 60s, releasing 2 groundbreaking albums in 1969 alone. Zeppelin 1 and 2 mixed newly emerging hard rock styles with blues rock, and both were executed with unmatched energy. After a weaker third album in 1970, Zeppelin locked themselves in a studio late in 1970 to record their next album. Later in 1971, they released Led Zeppelin 4, which many people, including myself, believe is their best record. The album begins by doubling down on the blues and hard rock sound that made them so successful in previous efforts with the songs Black Dog and Rock and Roll. The band starts to show a bit of a newer side on the album's third track, The Battle of Evermore, which is a folky song that sees Jimmy Page actually strumming a mandolin and Robert Plant doing a vocal duet with British folk singer Sandy Denny. To close out the A side, I think we all know the significance and greatness of Stairway to Heaven. It's progressive and it continues that folk rock component established on the previous track, but it ends in this glorious hard rock passage that's just one of the most recognizable of the decade. And while the A side is full of some of Zeppelin's best and most recognizable work, the B-side is full of deeper cuts that are still very influential and well celebrated. Misty Mountain Hop is a satisfying hard rock song that brings consistent energy back into the fold, while Four Sticks gives a similar vibe with a booming rhythm section from John Paul Jones and John Bonham. Going Back to California brings back the folk influence, as it's a calm acoustic piece that sets up the album's epic closer, When the Levee Breaks. Now, When the Levee Breaks is a blues song originally written in 1929 by Memphis Minnie and Kansas Joe McCoy, and this song was written in reference to a devastating flood of the Mississippi River in 1927, which killed hundreds of African Americans and displaced thousands. Jimmy Page and Led Zeppelin were pretty well known for taking strong elements of American blues music and putting it into their music, but we always must remember that blues music was a very important of African American culture in the 20th century to that point, and Led Zeppelin popularized this and essentially got rich off of it. Now, there's many bands that did this during the late 60s and 70s, but Zeppelin are kind of one of the bands that exploited it, for lack of a better term, the most. Well, we do have to mention the fact that there is some cultural appropriation going on there. Led Zeppelin's cover of When the Levee Breaks actually does it justice. It gives it a new psychedelic hard rock feel, which wraps up Led Zeppelin 4 nicely. An interesting note is that the band effectively rebranded themselves on this album, as each of the 4 members designed a new symbol. The 4 symbols were cryptic shapes that added a level of mystery to the band as they hit a new stride. We know they had already made a name for themselves before this record, but much like Pink Floyd and The Dark Side of the Moon, this album ascended them to new heights. I think it's Zeppelin's best record, though not by much, but it is a keystone in a very impressive and important catalog. Number 2 on my list, Unknown Pleasures by Joy Division. In the late 70s, punk rock had left its impact, and in many cases was quickly evolving into what is now called post-punk. Also emerging at that time was the gothic rock style, and Joy Division, a new band from Greater Manchester, UK, released their first album at the end of the decade which mixed these two styles and set a standard for the quickly approaching 80s. Consisting of guitarist and keyboardist Bernard Sumner, bassist Peter Hook, drummer Stephen Moore, and vocalist Ian Curtis, Joy Division came together in the mid-70s. The band eventually linked up with a label by the name of Factory Records and entered the studio for a few weeks in the spring of 1979. Just 2 months later, they released their debut, Unknown Pleasures. The album is a gloriously dark and minimalistic but energetic effort, and it has a rather lo-fi production style that's a bit stripped down and almost relatable when compared to a lot of the punk music of the time. The guitar tone is very distinct, the reverb on Ian Curtis vocals is iconic, and the echo of Stephen Moore's drums give this album a lot of personality. The album's opener, Disorder, perfectly marries these dark and energetic styles, and Ian Curtis' low, commanding voice is immediately put on display over probably the fastest and most upbeat riff on the album. Day of the Lords continues this general formula, though the album kind of seems to get a little darker as it goes on, with Candidate and Insight coming off as very depressive, slow, and minimalistic. Joy Division seemed to alternate between energetic, almost angry styles and this hopeless plotting, which, while it's not the most exciting thing, starts to let the listener know that Ian Curtis was dealing with some personal issues. The song New Dawn Fades closes the Outside, which is the name the band gave to the album's A-side. New Dawn Fades is one of their most recognizable songs, and this trend continues into the beginning of the B-side, which the band named Inside. On Inside, the 1-2 punch of She's Lost Control and Shadowplay bring back these energetic elements and show just how heavy Joy Division could be. Shadowplay gives the listener probably the most menacing attitude of the whole record, and it ditches that depression and hopelessness for a more powerful performance. Wilderness features a heavy dose of reverb in all instruments and vocals, and the energy picks up again on the song Interzone. I Remember Nothing closes the album in a bit more of a depressive, atmospheric, haunting fashion, as the song is a little more deliberate and quiet, with the exception of the sound of smashing glass, which was a result of the band actually smashing bottles in the studio. Unknown Pleasures did not initially have a ton of success, but it ended up picking up steam after the death of Ian Curtis a year later. This and their next album, Closer, which was their final album, are both seen as cult classics, with the gothic rock and post-punk style that became so widespread and prominent in the 80s really being defined on this record. Bands like The Cure and The Chameleons went on to emulate this style, and honestly they had a ton of success. And while Joy Division's not the only band responsible for this style at the end of the 70s, they were one of the most notable and most influential. My number 1 album of the 1970s is Paranoid by Black Sabbath. It's hard for me to state how important this album is to me. It was such an easy record to get into, and it was quick, accessible, and exciting, and one of the first hard rock albums that I ever remember hearing. Black Sabbath had only been around for a couple short years before this album came out, until they burst onto the scene in 1970 with both this album and the previous record, their self-titled debut. It's impressive how quickly this band ascended, as they didn't even play a live show until the second half of 1969. Soon after, they were signed to Philips Records, and they put out their self-titled debut before switching labels to Vertigo Records later in 1970, which released what would become Paranoid. Paranoid had a strong bias against the Vietnam War, and it was actually supposed to be called War Pigs, though the band decided to change the name of the album at the last minute to avoid any impact to record sales. So instead of naming the album War Pigs, Ozzy Osbourne, Tony Iommi, Geezer Butler, and Bill Ward decided to reserve that name for the album's opening track, which is a winding, almost progressive 8-minute hard rock anthem that really showed that opposition to Vietnam. It featured crushing riffing and drawn-out passages that gave a dark, new, dystopian feel to hard rock music. The title track is probably the one that drew many listeners to this album, as it's a quick, compact, efficient hard rock song with a faster, palm-muted riff from Tony Iommi. After the album gets off to an unbelievable start, Planet Caravan comes in, and it's a psychedelic, quiet, and calm journey with clean guitar over bongos while Ozzy Osbourne sings about an interstellar journey. Things returned to form on Iron Man, which was another hard rock hit that was popular with the masses. The dystopian lyrics of Iron Man were mixed with simplistic but extremely heavy riffing for 1970. The same can be said for Electric Funeral, the album's 5th track, which is one of the most underrated songs on the album and has been covered by many metal bands over the years. Hand of Doom has probably the most realistic and menacing lyrics, as the band experiments with quiet passages that suddenly turn loud for the song's chorus. The lyrics deal with American soldiers that went to Vietnam that came home with drug problems. Rat Salad is an instrumental piece that features a fun drum solo by Bill Ward, before the final track, the spacey and progressive Fairies Wear Boots, comes in. Fairies Wear Boots has some abstract, psychedelic lyrics that seem to deal with drugs. The riffing in the song structure is among the album's most satisfying and complex, and the track is a perfect perfect closer to an amazing album. Following this record, Black Sabbath would go on to release 4 more albums in the early to mid 70s that were of very similar quality. The band would stagnate towards the end of the decade, which would lead to some lineup changes. Ozzy Osbourne left the band at the end of the decade to embark on a successful solo career, while the rest of the members stayed together and recruited a number of different vocalists over the coming years before eventually reuniting. The legacy of Paranoid, let's face it, it's endless. It almost single-handedly inspired hard rock and metal bands, a crop of which popped up in the years following this and their next few records. Black Sabbath pushed the boundaries of heaviness at a time where rock music, it was still a relatively new genre. Tony Iommi's riffing and guitar tone inspired countless guitarists. Ozzy Osbourne's menacing vocals and dark lyrics were iconic and the start of a trend that really hasn't stopped. And while this style was popularized on Paranoid, it actually originated on their debut album released a few months before this one. There are the 8 albums from the 70s that I love the most. Tell me in the comments what you think. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? What did I miss? Either way, this has been fun. Thank you for watching.